find that other flip-flop because you are journeying to the card pool. I'm your host, Stu Galetta.
And I'm Kyle Robertson.
And today, we are talking about the top 10 hidden gems of Return to Ravnica.
This is part one of our two-part set review. Our second part will be all about the top 10 money cards of Return to Ravnica. But without further ado, let's start the review. So to start off with my number 10 on my top 10 favorite cards from this set, I'm going to start with a blue card, as kind of befits me as a player, and it's a Planeswalker no less. Not a very pricey one either. Jace, Architect of Thought. Now, this Planeswalker costs 4, 2, and double blue for 4 starting loyalty. He can +1 to, until your next turn, whenever a creature an opponent controls attacks, it gets -1/-0 until end of turn. Or he can -2 to reveal the top 3 cards of your deck. An opponent separates them into 2 piles. You put one pile into your hand and the other on the bottom of your deck. Or he can -8. For each player, search that player's library for a non-land card, exile it, and then that player shuffles their library. You can cast those cards without paying their mana costs. Now, this Planeswalker has a lot of text, and there is a lot to kind of wrap your head around and analyze with this guy. But let's look at some of these abilities in order. First of all, his plus ability effectively blanks token armies and other small utility creatures that might be either unblockable or somehow or other getting in for damage every turn. You see this kind of effect on other blue cards, but I never really take it all that seriously because so what? You're making creatures a little bit weaker. You're not actually killing them. They're not going anywhere. So what's really the point of this? I would argue that this is actually kind of a good plus ability to have because not only is it going to make you take less damage, arguably, from any attacks you could conceivably be taking, but it's also a cool political tool because it's not just when they attack you, it's whenever any creature an opponent controls attacks. Doesn't matter who they're going after, their creatures are going to be weaker. Then his second ability is kind of a mini fact or fiction. So it gives you bigger card selection. You can kind of play with your opponent's expectations by taking what pile they don't really want you to take, or vice versa, using some reverse psychology, just like the original fact or fiction. The only difference here is that the cards that you don't pick, instead of going to the grave, go back to your deck, which in some cases can be good, in some cases can be bad. And then his ultimate, I don't think I really have to explain too much. It's just very, very powerful. I mean, if you get there, for each player, including yourself, take basically the most powerful card from their deck and cast it for free. I can get on board with that. I think it's pretty solid. So overall, I think this Planeswalker, while it's not really all that talked about and hyped up like a lot of other ones are, this is, while comparatively weaker than something like Jace the Mind Sculptor, a very solid role player in the right deck, and something that can definitely hold its own against the field.
It's a great budget option. It does pass the Bolt test, which means it has over 3 loyalty, and for 4 costs, that's really good. We always have to look at a Planeswalker to see how does it give itself protection, and it does a good job in this case by also having a plus ability. Being able to nerf the damage that it would take is really, really powerful. But not only that, it's really good at any point of the game, just like you said, for the mini factor fiction. Getting more cards into your hand is always a good thing to have. And even if you don't somehow get the ultimate ability on this Jace, it's still going to either take some damage away from your life or put cards into your hand.
Yeah, I wouldn't say Jace Architect of Thought is overly powerful or should go in every single deck that has blue in it. It's not like that. But I just think it's a very balanced and well-designed kind of Planeswalker, where each effect is solid in its own context, and altogether, they make for a pretty solid utility card all around.
Now, moving away from a monocolored card to a multicolored card, I'm going to start off with a gold card named Rakdos Charm. It costs 1 red and 1 black like Rakdos colors. It's an instant that is modal. Choose one, exile all cards from target player's graveyard, or destroy target artifact. Or each creature deals 1 damage to its controller. Now the reason I like this, and as you've seen from my previous lists, anything that can destroy a person's graveyard strategy is really, really good, but also being able to choose between it is really, really powerful. So if you're playing someone who doesn't have a dredge kind of style, or a milled kind of style, or using their graveyard, you're going to be like, alright, this is a dead card. But in this case, having 2 other modes to choose from makes it so it isn't. Now, destroying target artifacts, pretty bland, more versatility. But the last one, and this is the part that I really enjoy about this card, each creature deals 1 damage to its controller. Noted this does hurt you if you have creatures on the field. But if somebody's using any kind of swarm token strategy to have a huge army to just come in and swing big, this can be a game ender for them. So if they're at the point where they're ready to come in and swing hard and kill you, you can turn the tables on them for just 2 mana. And this way, instead of you losing, they just completely, out of the blue, lost the game.
Yeah, this card, while it may not be one of the money cards from Return to Ravnica, is still a pretty popular card from the set because it's in a lot of modern sideboards. And that's because in the context of modern, and even in the context of a lot of Commander games, for example, or casual games, all of these modes can be really useful. As you said, Stu, nerfing any one player's graveyard for 2 mana and instant speed is really awesome. And also, for 2 mana and instant speed, destroying any artifact — there are a lot of game-breaking artifacts out there that deserve to be destroyed — is pretty solid. However, as you said, my favorite ability is the last one, where each creature does 1 damage to its own controller. In my own experience in Modern, Splinter Twin back then was a big thing. It's not anymore. But this was my favorite counter to Splinter Twin out of the sideboard, because they make a billion creatures in order to kill you with their token-making, copying combo, and then you just play this card, you probably take maybe 2-3 damage max, and they take however many tokens that they had, and they automatically pretty much lose the game unless they have a counter. I have to say, out of the 10 different guild charms in the entire Return to Ravnica block, this one may not be my favorite out of all of them, but it might just be the best. On the theme of instants and sorceries here, I actually have a card next up on my list that makes all of your sorceries into instants, and that card is, at my number 9 on my list, Hypersonic Dragon. This is a 5 mana creature. It is 3 colorless and a blue and a red, so it is an Is-It creature. It's a dragon, of course, a 4/4 with flying and haste, and it has the ability to give all of your sorcery spells flash. This is pretty simplistic creature, really, but I love it because of the flavor that it captures and the spirit of Is-It, as well as just the cool utility of its effect. We see a lot of cards out there like Prophet of Krufix, which has been banned in several formats, and also the Vidalcan Orrery that we looked at from 5th Dawn, which give pretty much everything flash, but in this case, it's just sorceries, and while that may be slightly narrower, it comes on a really awesome body. A 4/4 with flying and haste for 5 mana, that is pretty darn good, and it's even a dragon, which is a very relevant creature type. As I've said before, and I'll say again, giving things that don't have flash is really, really good. Giving your sorceries instant speed, that means any potential board wipes you have that are sorceries now become instants, which I don't have to tell you how good that is. And it makes a lot of potential combos that didn't really exist because certain cards you can't cast on your opponent's turn and use them to their maximum effectiveness a lot more possible. It also turns pretty much anything into a surprise attack on them if it's an instant or sorcery. So as long as this card is out, not only is your opponent going to get smacked with a big flying creature every turn, but they're going to have to worry about every card that you have in your hand, because God knows what you'll be able to play next anytime you want.
Indeed, Kyle. Is-It is, again, a very spell slinger kind of strategy. And like you said, and got it down, is, yeah, flash is dangerous in those colors. Now, noted, if you are trying to do any kind of dragon tribal stuff and you're going for more of a creature toolbox, this might not be the best dragon for that. But for what this dragon does in Is-It or even Teamer colors is super, super strong. And as you've heard from us before, cheating stuff into play is really big. Now, you may not be cheating stuff into play, but you're bending the rules to your favor with this card, and that's just as dangerous. Well, going from your Is-It love to my Is-It love, Chemister's Trick. It costs 1 Is-It, so a blue and a red, and it's an instant as well. Target creature you don't control gets -2/-0 until end of turn, and attacks this turn if able. Also, it has Overload for 5, so 3 colorless, and a blue or red, which means you change the wording of this thing from target creature to each creature. So in this case, it's very similar to Cyclonic Rift, in which you're getting the overload. So you're doing something that's going to affect all of your opponents and not you, which is really, really powerful. But the reason I really like this card is because it's a way to dismantle an opponent's army, but do it in a very subtle way. Typically, you're going to play this for its overload cost. Now, again, if you need mana or there's something that has to happen right now and you need to take care of it, you can pay this for its 2 cost. That's totally fine. So let's say someone's building a token army, or they have a big combo piece out, or they're just ready on the cusp to like go in and swing big. This way, that person is going to have to attack and attack big. But not only that, all their big guys are a lot smaller. So this way, it's like, all right, they may be attacking and doing stuff, but it doesn't mean that they're actually going to do anything. They can attack into walls, they can attack into indestructible guys, they can attack into a whole bunch of different things and just be forced to lose what they want to keep. And that is really, really powerful.
As I mentioned back when I was talking about Jace Architect of Thought, I'm not usually a huge fan of these kind of one-shot abilities that make creatures weaker, so on the face of this card, I've never really been all that impressed with it, but I think you are right, Stu, in that the interesting twist here is, one, the overload cost effect, because overload is just pretty good, but the fact that it makes those creatures smaller and forces them to attack. That can force your opponent into some very uncomfortable kind of situations. And again, while this may not be all that effective against an opponent who has a couple massive creatures, this is especially effective against a token army, where you essentially eliminate both their offense and their defense at the same time, and I suppose that really goes for just about anything you could cast this on. But also the fact it being an instant, it can come out of the blue like that. Pretty good. Not a card that I'd necessarily rush to put into any of my decks, but an interesting consideration for sure. Just going off of that, I suppose, to a card that can maybe help you keep from losing the game as well, I don't know. I guess I kind of just have a thing for big creatures in this block. But at number 8 on my list, we have Angel of Serenity, going to a white card this time. It is a 7-mana creature. It costs 4 and triple white. It also has flying. It's a 5/6. When it enters the battlefield, you may exile up to 3 other target creatures from the battlefield or graveyards. And when Angel of Serenity leaves the battlefield, return the exiled cards to their owner's hands. For a relatively large mana cost, you get a large body, but the best part is that this is basically triple Oblivion Ring when it comes into play. That's nothing to sneeze at, and it even gets better than that, because while it can only target creatures, you can also get creatures essentially back from the graveyard that have already been used. White doesn't very often get that effect, but when it does, it is quite powerful, as we've seen with things like Emiria Shepherd and Sun Titan. Another cool thing about this card is that its clause triggers when Angel of Serenity leaves the battlefield. It doesn't have to die for you to get those cards back. All it has to do is leave the battlefield, get bounced, exiled, what have you. It's going to go off pretty much no matter what, unless somebody manages to somehow counter that ability. I also like the fact that, again, this can be a politics card because you can target other people and give them their stuff back from the graveyard. But just on the face of it, being able to recur several of your creatures possibly just by playing a giant flyer, or eliminating an opponent's entire offense as long as you can keep it around. When this thing leaves, the creatures don't even come to play, they go back to the hand. So if you exiled 3 of your opponent's huge creatures, they're going to go back to the hand and they'll have to cast them again. Overall, just a very, very powerful card. I like this in white a lot.
Definitely. And this is a card that I've always praised. It's almost like White's Eternal Witness, like you said with Sun Titan, Kyle. It, again, gives you a lot of leverage. It can help you out in a lot of different scenarios. Every time I see this card in a Blink deck, I'm instantly like, I have to get rid of this, otherwise they're just going to abuse the crap out of this thing.
It definitely is ripe for abuse, for sure. But I see next on your list we have yet another card that talks about hating on the graveyard instead of using it.
Yeah, I'm on theme here, and this is a type of card that I've spoke about before that I haven't seen too often, and to me it's becoming more surprising that they exist. It's a red card called Annihilating Fire. It costs 1 colorless and 2 red. It's an instant. This card here deals 3 damage to target creature or player. If a creature dealt damage this way would die this turn, exile it instead. So, like I've said before, it's like some other red instants and sorceries that I've said before that are very similar to this. It makes it so that you can spot removal something permanently from the game. If there's a creature that is used as a combo piece, or a recurable, or it's just like so annoying you have to make sure it's gone and gone for good, this is a great way of doing it. It works on players as well. So being able to quickly, quote-unquote, lightning bolt a planeswalker a player or a creature like this is really, really valuable.
Yeah, this card kind of makes Lightning Bolt cry a little bit, unfortunately, because 3 mana for 3 damage versus 1 mana for 3 damage. Not quite the same rate. However, 3 mana for 3 damage to a creature or a player is a pretty serviceable damage spell, all things considered. Also, as you said, Stu, the ability to exile creatures is kind of rare in red, but it is pretty useful. Now, I think that a card we look back at in Khans of Tarkir called Burn Away is probably the superior version of this because that one exiles the entire graveyard rather than just the creature that dies. However, this being a lot lower on the curve than that, it certainly can be a useful card and a role player in the right deck. So, yeah, I don't think there's too much to say about this other than good burn spell, slightly overcosted with a little maybe upside too. Well, going from effect damage to combat damage, my next card is a card that loves combat damage. Number 7 on my list for Return to Ravnica Hidden Gems is Necropolis Reagent. It is another giant creature, a 6/5 vampire with flying for 6. It's a black creature, so it costs 3 colorless and a triple black. And its ability: whenever a creature you control does combat damage to a player, put that many +1/+1 counters on it. If you recall back from our 5th Dawn review, we talked about a card called Mephedros Vampire, which is one of my favorite cards from that set, and I mentioned that I believed that another card did that effect one better. This is that other card. Necropolis Reagent, while it is part of a very, very relevant tribe, being vampires, and very on flavor too, with the getting stronger for somebody else dying or losing life thing, this is just an absurdly powerful effect if you think about it. And the fact that it gives it to all of your creatures as a sort of super uber powered anthem that it also gives to itself is really great. So even if this thing is the only thing on your field, you swing with it, you do 6 damage, it's going to become a 12 power creature. And then it'll become a 24, and so on, and so on. And the counters are just going to keep piling up. This is one of those rare lords where the bonus doesn't go away after it leaves the battlefield, really, because if you've already gotten your value and your money's worth out of it, the counters you put on other creatures are just going to stick around and continue to make things harder for your opponents. This is kind of a staple for me in any mono-black deck I build, and any deck with black in it. I certainly consider this because it can be a whopping game ender of a card that everyone should fear.
It's also noted that black has very evasive creatures, like going from Filth with Urborg to make it so your creatures can attack and not have to worry about being blocked, to Menace, to Fear. So it's not impossible to have a black creature, no matter how big or small, come in and make sure it does its damage. Also noted, if you're doing a vampire or demon deck, they all have flying. So you have to just make sure, like, alright, if they have ground guys, I'm getting in and I'm getting big. So this is a really good card, like you said, for any black deck that is trying to go in for big damage. And 6 mana, yeah, but I mean, it's so easy to produce a lot of black mana.
Well, I couldn't agree more, Stu, but let's go from really big to really small, and another card I actually have experience playing with in Modern. What have you got next?
Yeah, onto a mono blue deck. We're going to go right into Mizium Skin. Costs 1 blue, and it's an instant. Target creature you control gets +0/+1 and gains hexproof until end of turn. And it has overload for 2, which, like we said before, changes the instance of target to each. What you would do is, if you have only 1 mana open, for example, you would say, hey, my guy's being targeted with something, let me go ahead, make it so he can't be targeted, and give it a little bit of a bigger butt. But also, to be noted, it only costs 2 mana to use the Overload ability, which is very low costed compared to all the other Overload cards that we see out there. So being able to make it so your entire army is a little bit bigger and untouchable is really, really huge. You know, if you leave 2 open mana, most people are going to be like, alright, they have a counter spell open, especially with blue. But if you go and play this, this would totally change the style of play on them.
Actually, the place where I have a lot of experience playing this card is in a just for fun modern deck that I made at one point with a lot of heroic creatures from the Theros block. Now, for anyone who didn't know, heroic is an ability that rewards you for targeting your creatures with spell effects, such as this one. This is an especially good one to use in this case because not only can you pay 1 mana to basically blank an opposing removal spell and make your creature a little bit bigger for the turn to boot, but also if you anticipate them using a couple to try and get rid of your entire army, you can just pay one more, use that overload cost, and just say, nope, you're not getting rid of any of my creatures this turn. Try again, see you later. While it may be, again, slightly niche in its use, it's definitely fun, and the low cost of the overload makes it definitely a card to consider if you're nervous about spot removal. Speaking of creatures, I'm going to go to a card that specifically focuses on creatures, or a couple of them in fact. It is a multicolored card called Jared's Orders. This is a sorcery in the Golgari colors, 2 colorless, a black and a green, to play. Search your library for up to 2 creature cards and reveal them. Put one into your hand and the other into your graveyard, and then of course, shuffle your library. They pretty much nailed, I think, all the guilds in Return to Ravnica, but Golgari may have gotten the best cards overall in terms of utility and power just combined in a neat little package, and this is one of them. While this may be slightly boring because it's a tutor effect, and we see a lot of those in Magic, and they're generally considered to be pretty powerful, if not unfairly overpowered, this is kind of a neat twist on it, because not only are you getting any 2 creatures you want from your deck just for 4 mana, you only end up getting one of them to your hand, sure, but in a lot of cases, putting a creature into the graveyard is sometimes even better than putting it into your hand. Let's just think about some of the things you can do with this card. Put an Eternal Witness into your hand. That's pretty awesome. And then at the same time, I don't know, flip a Golgari Grave Troll or another Dredge creature into your graveyard so you can just start churning the cards into the graveyard, find something to get back with that Eternal Witness if you didn't have something already. That's just the beginning of the kind of utility that this card can bring to the table. And I think that while it is a bit more expensive than most people are used to for a tutor, the power level that it brings with it makes it definitely worth the cost.
Yeah, and actually, when I read this card, the first thing that really pops into my head is a tutor that's banned in Commander, which is Gifts Ungiven. It makes it so that you can get cards to your hand and also fill up your grave. So the fact that that's banned, and this is kind of like a mini version of that, is really something to note, because if you're doing something that's similar to a card that's banned, there's definitely something that is very abusable with it. And like you said, it's Golgari, and they love stuff in the grave. You have Dredge, you have your Incarnations that just love sitting in there. It's just got so much value for any deck. Now, moving away from something that gives you all the tutor power to something as removal, we're going to go into an enchantment, which should be the first one in our block to talk about, and it is called Detention Sphere. It costs 3 mana, a colorless, a blue, and a white. And what it does is, when it enters the battlefield, you may exile target non-land permanent, not named Detention Sphere, and all other permanents with the same name as that permanent. When Detention Sphere leaves the battlefield, return the exiled cards to the battlefield under their owner's control. So it's very similar to Banishing Light and Oblivion Ring. But the thing that's noted on this is that it removes stuff with the same name. So for example, if you have a token on the field and somebody is creating multiple copies of that token, whether it's a golem, an elf, a goblin, they all have the same name. So if you play this, exile the one, and in tandem, the rest of them go away as well. So it's really good as a pseudo board wipe.
Yeah, I don't think there's too much to add about Detention Sphere, Stu, other than I really like this card. This came just shy of making my list, too, because when I'm playing blue and white, I always pack a Detention Sphere, because this is basically for one more color, but the exact same converted mana cost, one-upping both Banishing Light and Oblivion Ring. The best part about this card is that, as you first suggested, it can wipe out token armies. The best thing about tokens, of course, being when they get rid of your Detention Sphere inevitably, the tokens aren't coming back. That's just not the way it works. So it essentially can be a board wipe for just 3 mana and an enchantment that in some cases goes back to your hand and can be reused again later. This is just a very, very solid piece of removal, and overall, I think the Return to Ravnica block in general really nailed removal, especially spot removal like this one. And like I said, this is just a better Oblivion Ring, so what's not to love there? Now, I'm moving on to another enchantment, one that may be fun for some people, but not so much for others. I guess it depends on how sadistic you are. Number 5 on my list here is Havoc Festival. It costs 6 mana, 4 colorless, a black, and a red, which puts it in the Rakdos camp. It is an enchantment that says players can't gain life. And then also, at the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player loses half of his or her life, rounded up. The first thing to keep in mind is that, yes, this is going to hurt you just as much as it's going to hurt everybody else. However, the one saving grace that it does have is that it happens at the beginning of each upkeep, so all of your opponents are going to get hurt first, assumably, before this comes back to hurt you. Also, the fact that players just can't gain any life really hurts a lot of decks, because lifelink is one of the more popular abilities out there, as well as just straight up gaining life with cards the likes of the Soul Sisters cards and Suture Priest, and all of those cards like Authority of the Consuls too that say whenever creatures enter the battlefield you gain X amount of life. The other element of this is that, keep in mind, it says rounded up in terms of the life that you lose. Normally, cards like this say rounded down, so just in case you would lose the game from them, you can't go any lower than 1 life. Not so with Havoc Festival, because if you are at 1 life, it's going to round up to 1, and you lose the game. So, this card can actually take people out rather than just taking them down to an arbitrary amount. And that's one of the reasons why I really do like it.
Careful timing is part of this card. Like, you don't just willy-nilly throw this down when you have 6 mana. You have to be making sure that, alright, I can play the long game and the short game right now. So if this thing gets destroyed, my plan isn't over. Also, one of the things I really do love about this card is usually whenever it's at the beginning of the upkeep, usually your opponents get the benefit. So like a card for Rites of Flourishing, for example, your opponent gets to draw a card first, and then they get to play an additional land, whereas you only get to play the additional land first. This is penalizing them where you want it to be. And there's tons of other cards out there, and especially in red, where it really hurts players' lives. Heartless Hitagetsu is a creature who just typically does exactly what this thing is doing. So it's like this with that makes it so there's really no way you should lose. Now, saying that, there are ways. I've played against this card, and I've been able to pull out some wins from it, but it is very challenging and it's very taxing. And the longer this card stays on the field, the harder it is to win. So now moving from a big fatty card to a very simple small card. Looks like we almost switched roles here today, Kyle. I'm going to be playing my first green card called Urban Burgeoning. It costs 1, which is just a forest. And it's an enchantment aura. Enchanted land has untap this land during each player's untap step. So very simple, very early you can play this card. Now the reason I like this so much is it does something that's very big. It untaps a land. Now it only untaps 1. So we see this effect in a couple other cards. Used to be Prophet of Krufix when that was in play. Seedborn Muse is another example in which you are constantly untapping this. So you can see why there's value with this, because a card that was banned and a card that costs a lot of money can do this effect. Now this goes on 1 land, so it's a little bit different in this regard. But you might only need 1 land to untap. So for me, I would love to play this on a Maze of Ith, a Gaia's Cradle, a Cabal Coffers, and make it so I can constantly keep reusing this stuff and getting the value out of it. Like, Maze of Ith is a phenomenal card, but only being able to use it once until it comes around to you again can sometimes be a negative. Being able to stop 1 creature attacking every turn at no cost is really, really big, and I would love to see that happen in the game.
Yeah, I sort of question the overall usefulness and utility of this card if you're just smacking it down on a basic land and hoping for the best. Long term, is that really going to net you a whole lot? No, probably not. But as you adequately pointed out, Stu, there are a lot of utility lands out there that can certainly benefit from being able to untap every turn, such as Maze of Ith, as you said, being my primary example, but other lands possibly as well, like Nykthos and Cabal Coffers and what have you. It has to be the right situation. This isn't just going to automatically generate value most of the time. At times, it can certainly be a role player and a good card to have on your team.
And if we go into all the other different colors and color combinations, they all have their specialty lands. And in Commander, you don't just play basic lands or just stuff that filter your mana. You use lands that give you advantage. So being able to constantly reuse that land that is giving you an advantage is something that will put you ahead of your opponents.
Point taken. However, I kind of prefer the old-fashioned way of taking care of my opponents and getting ahead of them, just blowing their stuff up. So let's look at my number 4 card, which does just that. It is Dread Boer. This is another Rakdos card for me. It's a sorcery, and it costs 2, a black and a red. And it has the very simple text of destroy target creature or planeswalker. This may be a bit of a boring card to have on my top 10 list, but I just like it a lot because it just does the job for a very low cost. I often compare this card to Terminate, which is another instant actually with the exact same mana cost that does a pretty similar thing in that it destroys target creature. This one, you sacrifice the sort of instant speed of it for also the added benefit of being a 2-mana potential planeswalker destruction spell, something that has come into play for me multiple times when I have had this card in a deck. 2 mana to blow up any creature regardless of what color it is or what type it is or anything like that, just unlimited destroy target creature or any planeswalker. That is very efficient undercosted destruction, and sign me up.
I said it before and I'll say it again. Modal cards are great, and this is Terminate 2.0. Just having more options just gives you more value. Like if there's a planeswalker out that is extremely troublesome and you don't have any way of attacking to get through to kill it, having a source that is removal for it is always valuable in your hand. Now, moving from something that would absolutely remove it to more of a let's just pain you by letting it stay there and torment you a little bit, is my card called Arrest. It is a 3-drop enchantment. I'm totally going for a theme on this if you couldn't pick it up. It costs 2 colorless and 1 white, and it's an aura. You enchant creature. The enchanted creature can't attack, can't block, and can't use its activated abilities. Now, white has other cards that are very similar to this. We see Pacifism, Bonds of Fate, and Prison Term. Now, those are a little bit different than what this one does, because Arrest kind of covers all. So if there's a creature that is trying to attack, it's not going to be able to attack. If it's got a big butt, it can't block. But noted, if it has some sort of tap ability or any kind of form of activate ability, it just can't use that. So a commander like Rune of the Hidden Realms, for example, is one that has an activate ability. He's able to attack and make it so that he doesn't tap to do it, and he can also block. Being able to shut down a blink engine for a deck like that is really big. But also taking out its lead attack force and block force is really detrimental. Now, there's other creatures out there that are phenomenal commanders that would absolutely destroy. And I'm sure, Kyle, you have some examples to tell us about that.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of them out there. One that I can definitely think of is Thassa, God of the Sea. While it may not be a creature some of the time, it does end up being a creature a lot of the time because it's making a lot of other creatures unblockable. Being able to shut something like that down is super good, and that's just a small scratching of the surface of the ceiling that this card can potentially have. This is definitely an improvement over Pacifism and other cards of its type in that it can shut down activated abilities. Notably, this card is not new in Return to Ravnica. It was printed a couple times in different sets before its printing in Return to Ravnica, but it certainly has aged very well with time and actually is still somewhat of a sideboard card in certain decks. It's also an aura, which makes it a pretty easy type to search up, especially in white. All in all, pretty simple card, but again, definitely not bad. Speaking of value, how about a card that shuts down a value, potentially? And when I say shut down, I mean just shuts down absolutely the end forever shut up. And that card, which I like to call Shut Up for short, is Counterflux. This is going back to the Izzet Guild, a 3-mana instant. It costs 2 blue and 1 red. Counterflux can't be countered by spells or abilities, and it is simply counter target spell you don't control. Notably, it also contains the Izzet's Overload effect, which basically just adds 1 colorless to its converted mana cost, making it a 4 overload, or 3 for its normal speed. Counterflux itself is pretty notable in that it is a counterspell that itself cannot be countered. Not a whole lot of counterspells can do that. I believe there is one out there with Split Second, which does essentially the same thing, but this absolutely just can't be stopped. And if you think for a minute also about the Overload ability, this card in itself, for a 3-mana spell that counters anything, that's not too bad of a rate. The colors of its mana cost may make it a bit difficult to cast in certain circumstances, and it can't be countered, so that would be pretty good in and of itself. However, the ability to just add 1 more to that and counter each spell you don't control, that can just be an incredibly good effect. This kind of thing stops storm decks, for example, dead in their tracks, because a lot of times decks that play lots of instants and sorceries, or even sometimes creatures that work nicely alongside instants and sorceries, especially in cases of flash, they will have some kind of ridiculous dumb combo where they'll instant speed one thing out and then chain it onto another and another and another, and they'll just keep stacking things up, as a storm deck, for example, would like to do. Counter Flux gives you a way to say, enough, you're done, time out, that's over. And they can't stop it because it can't be countered by anything. So there is really no sense then in trying to play anything after this card is played. As I said, this card just says shut up to everyone with capital letters, and it being an unstoppable counterspell, that's pretty cool.
Now, for you veteran players out there, you may also realize something with this. If there is a stack that has grown, someone plays something, a person has response, another person has response, and the stack has just grown and grown and grown, playing this at the very end gets rid of all of that. It completely wipes away what happened and everything that has happened since then. So it makes it so for one extra mana, you've completely decimated anything else that any other player has tried to do. So if you're going to go for a win con in the game, for example, and make it so like, all right, I'm going to play this, somebody has a response, they go to counter that, or they go to do something else, and another player has something to do that. If you hold up enough mana for this, it'll make sure it will go through and go through hard. And like you said, Kyle, it is shut up. It's let me just do what I want to do because I am doing it. Moving away from one counterspell to another, mine is a little bit simpler than what you have, but it's a great card nonetheless. It's called Syncopate. It costs X and blue, and it's an instant. Counter target spell unless its controller plays X. If the spell is countered this way, exile it instead of putting it into its owner's graveyard. Now, one of the great reasons I love this card is because it can scale with the game. And any X card that can scale with the game is really valuable in Commander, because if this was one of the regular counter spells, like Mana Leak, for example, where they have to pay a finite amount of mana, and if it's late in the game, that's not a problem for a player. They can just simply get around that. If you're making it so that you can definitely counter a spell, and you're making sure it goes that way, you're exiling what it was. So like we said before, with like Golgari decks where they don't mind if it's countered, it's in the grave, they can get it back. This is preventing that from happening. So it makes it so, alright, you're safe, and you're definitely making it so you are safer in the long run as well.
I usually kind of debate how good this card is, because there are certain cases, and you're absolutely right, Stu, where exiling the thing that you counter is definitely a lot better than some other options. But I always end up weighing this card against another X cost counterspell like Condescend, for example, where instead of the exile clause, it allows you to scry too. I'm not honestly sure which is better. In certain situations, there are things you could say for both of them, and there are certainly a bunch of other just X mana counter spells like this. They kind of scale over the course of the game, which is useful, but I don't find them quite as good as cards like Counter Flux, where it's just a set cost and hard counter anything. However, as I indicated before, Counter Flux, while it may be able to stop stack-related shenanigans, does not exile things, and exiling is one of the only ways to make sure you permanently get rid of the things that are going to cause you problems. So in those cases, I can see how this card might be a better option.
But let us know in the comments down below which one you would rather use as a counter spell. Syncopate or Counter Flux? Both have their niche and both are really good, but which one would you typically use?
Well, I'm going to go back to multicolor now, actually, and I'm going to go back to the Golgari Guild, because as I said, Golgari, I think, got the best deal out of all of the guilds in Return to Ravnica. Number 2 on my list is Corpsejack Menace. This is a very frightening-looking creature, actually. He costs 4 mana, 2 colorless, and a black and a green for a 4/4. And if one or more +1/+1 counters will be placed on a creature you control, twice that many +1/+1 counters are placed on it instead. We've gone over it time and time and time again in these segments. Doubling Season is a good card. 1/2 of Doubling Season is a good card. Even maybe arguably 1/4 of Doubling Season is still a pretty good card. And that's exactly what Corpsejack Menace is on a body. A 4 mana 4/4, that is a very serviceable rate and making for quite an aggressive and even good on the defense kind of creature. And this card, by its existence, makes so many decks completely busted, gave Guru of Spores being the primary suspect looking at in Commander. But just think about the possible ridiculous things you can do with this card. You put one counter on your entire team, it puts two counters on your entire team. You put 6 counters on one creature, for example, it's going to put 12 on. The reasons this card is good are obvious. It's not very subtle about what it does, but it doesn't have to be. It is just an incredibly powerful card, and one that, for whatever reason, doesn't seem to be a money card. I can't quite figure that one out, but I think it should be. It's definitely one of the best cards in this set by far.
Well, a reason for that is it did get reprinted in one of the new Commander partner sets, and the one Golgari Commander pretty much makes it so that if a creature goes to the graveyard, the +1/+1 counter can get moved to another creature. If you keep Corpjack Menace from hitting the graveyard and that guy's out, it can just make it so that counters keep coming out and flooding out like stupid crazy. And I mean, it's partners, and from the other stuff I've seen, I'd love to be able to put red in this deck somehow. Just be able to like flood in some haste, swing in for big damage, keep the counters flowing. That would be a scary deck, and honestly, a sick build I would love to see in the future. But moving on to my number 2, I also am going to be using a little bit of the black mana. I have another enchantment, which seems to be my theme here. It is called Underworld Connections. It costs 1 colorless and double black. And like I said, it's an enchantment aura. You enchant a land, and the enchanted land has tap, pay 1 life, draw a card. Now, it's a very simple thing. For being able to say, hey, I don't need mana this turn, I'll pay a little life and I'll draw a card. Now, it's very under the radar of most players because it's like, alright, I don't mind if you get less life, you know, you're helping me out in this case. Like, yeah, take the card. But the thing is it makes it so that you have a greater chance to dig for answers. And the best part about it is not many people are going to be aware of it, or at least inexperienced players for that matter. Maybe some veterans know how valuable this card is, but most people will really hold back from wasting some sort of targeted removal on this. It's not hurting their gameplay, and if anything, it's making it so your life is a little lower. But, like I said, it's what Black does. Black does not mind giving a little life in order to get a full victory for itself. So this is a really good card for any deck that needs any kind of draw.
I don't know, Stu. I'm kind of on the fence about this one. I mean, it may not be fair of me to say, but the card that I can't help but draw comparisons from with this is Phyrexian Arena. For the exact same mana cost, color, and all, you get an enchantment that's not an aura that just kind of stays on the field, and every turn makes you lose 1 life, but in return gives you a card. In some cases, I can see how this card absolutely would fly more under the radar and might allow you to get maybe a little more benefit out of it, but I just hate the fact that you have to tap a land and forego making mana from it for an entire turn just in order to pay a life and sure draw a card. But I don't know. I mean, I just am never really that comfortable with using my lands in that respect. And I know some lands have these kind of abilities just tacked onto them anyway, and I'm on the fence about those enough as it is. Just putting a aura on one of them that may force me to forgo mana and probably will get just blown up at some point in the game for whatever reason. I don't know. I hate to be negative about these things, but I'm not entirely sold on this one.
Here's a couple upsides. So, like we see in Black, there are a lot of enchantments, like you said, Phyrexian Arena, or even Necropotence, in which a player will totally disregard their entire draw step to draw cards. The whole point about this is going big and going big hard. But also with Underworld Connections, this can work the turn that you play it, for example. Wait till turn 4. Go ahead, you played it on land. Like, you don't want to play anything else for whatever reason. So this way you can save up the mana just in case, you whenever, and tap it. Pay the life, draw a card. Very simple, very elegant. It gives you more answers. Yeah, you might be forcing your mana to be used in a different setting, but it gives you a contingency of always having draw when you need it, whenever you need it.
Well, staying slightly on the theme of Black, I'm going to go to my number 1 card, and this is actually one that was, I think, just 1 or 2 spots shy of being one of the money cards from Return to Ravnica, but I am so glad that it wasn't, because that means I get to talk about it. Absolutely my favorite card from this entire set, and probably my favorite Planeswalker of all time. We have the Golgari Planeswalker, Braska the Unseen. She costs 5 to play, which is 3 colorless, a black, and a green, putting her firmly in Golgari Guild. Once again, Golgari got the best cards in Return to Ravnica. She has 3 abilities and starts off with a whopping 5 loyalty, which is pretty nice. +1, until your next turn, whenever a creature deals combat damage to Braska the Unseen, destroy that creature. Or, -3, destroy target non-land permanent. Or, -7, put 3 1/1 black assassin creature tokens into play, and those assassin tokens have, whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, that player loses the game. I love Vraska. I really cannot say it enough times how much I love this card, and as I said, this is, I think, probably one of the best Planeswalkers in the game. It's certainly my very favorite Planeswalker of all time, because it covers all the bases so nicely. The plus ability. You want usually some kind of protection for your Planeswalker, and most of the time, we think tokens. So, of course, you make some tokens, they can absorb some of the damage that would be meant for your Planeswalker, that's great, whatever. Vraska, on the other hand, takes a slightly more underhanded, but infinitely more destructive approach. Normally, it's going to take at least 2 creatures attacking a Planeswalker to kill it, and that's not even counting any blockers. So just imagine you throwing this down and using the plus ability. People are going to have second, third, and fourth thoughts about trying to go after this thing when every creature that they do damage to it is just going to be soaking up damage that they'd rather have going to you. And on top of that, to add insult to injury, their creatures are just going to get blown up. I really can't imagine a better deal than that, and it's not uncommon to see this take out 2 or 3 creatures at once in that respect. Also, the -3 ability to destroy target non-land permanent. As non-land permanent, that deals with pretty much any conceivable threat you could think of, other than stupid lands like a Nykthos or a Cabal Coffers or a Gaia's Cradle or what have you. So sad, not a whole lot of things can do that. However, as I said, destroying anything, whether it be a creature, an artifact, an enchantment, another planeswalker, even anything like that that is giving you problems, is such an elegant and powerful ability to have. And then, finally, in terms of protection and destruction, you also normally want a planeswalker to have, hopefully, an ultimate that can end the game. Vraska delivers once again, and in a very kind of cool way that works well with cards like Doubling Season in these colors, as well as Parallel Lives. Just think about that. Instead of making 3 game-ending assassin tokens, making 6 or 9 game-ending assassin tokens. And especially when black is in the mix, you do have more ways to sneak those by defending creatures and possibly end the game. All in all, just look at this card. Vraska is magnificent. Does everything you could possibly want on a body that is gonna stick around most of the time. I love this.
I love this Planeswalker too. I want to use it all the time. Like you said, the +1 ability, it really has the best protection for almost any Planeswalker out there, for the hard fact that it's going to more than 1-for-1 with it. But I also love it for the fact if you are losing and you need some sort of form of removal, you can make it come down and come down hard. Like as we saw with the Jace earlier, like if you need to dig for an answer, you can. But for Vraska, she is the answer, which is really good. But lastly to note for the ultimate, I prefer typically an emblem on any of my ultimates just to make sure it's not just a one-shot that could fail. An emblem, for those who don't know, is stuck in a game, and there's no way to get rid of it unless the game ends, or if you use like a Karn Ultimate, for example, where that game ceases to exist and leaves that emblem still in there. Like, that's the only way to really get away from it. So having the 3 assassin tokens come out with that ability is super powerful, and like you said, there's tons of ways to give them evasive forms of attack. It just can be kind of niche, just because you spend all these turns building her up and like literally taunting your opponent saying, hey, I'm gonna do this and you can't stop me unless you really want to lose something big. It just kind of seems for me a little lackluster. I mean, very timing, it could work. It can definitely be a threat on the board. Overall, I love this card. It's really good, and I'm totally on board with you, Kyle. Not my number 1, but I can definitely warrant it in the top 10.
All right, Stu. Well, what have you got for your number 1? I see it's kind of an understated one, and I like that. Tell us more.
Yeah, and actually, if anything, this card would go perfect with Vraska. This is my land, and for those of you who know, I love bringing up at least one land in all my top 10 lists. This is a very simple one and a super budget one, and I use this in every deck when I get the chance. It's called Rogue's Passage. It's a land, comes into play untapped, and it produces 1 colorless mana, so right there that's decent. Now for 4 mana you can tap this, and target creature is unblockable this turn. I love having lands, and I love having lands that can make it so I can get more value out of them beyond just mana. And this is an effect that doesn't force me to sacrifice it to use it, so it can recur continuously throughout the game. So for 4 mana, inherently 5 to tap this, you can make it so that your commander can attack and not be blocked, building towards the commander damage. Now there's tons of cards out there that are really, really powerful once they hit and deal damage. Daxos is a great card, Master of Cruelties, any commander, or for example the Braska tokens. If you are able to produce those and make it so you can swing for game, huge, huge advantage. It's just such a great card, and it's so easy to have it slide into any deck.
Yeah, I like this card a lot too, Stu, and I have to say it was probably an oversight on my part to leave this off the top 10 hidden gems of Return to Ravnica, because this certainly is an overlooked, underutilized hidden gem in all senses. Making a creature unblockable is probably the most powerful form of evasion present in the game, and the fact that it's repeatable on a land, while 5 mana inherently is a bit pricey, the fact that this 1 gives you mana, 2 comes into play untapped, and 3 gives you this incredibly powerful ability that you can use over and over again in the course of a game, and potentially, in most cases, probably win because of it. That's just very, very good. Again, this card is simple and elegant in what it does, and doesn't necessarily merit a ton of conversation, but the list of things that it can do for you is endless, and yeah, I'd say this is a pretty darn good number 1, Stu. Kudos to you. So that's our pool time today. If you thought the water was just right, feel free to let us know in the comments down below. Or if you didn't like the toys we played with today, give us some of your recommendations as well.
Now be sure to check out our following episode in which we talk about the top 10 money cards from Return to Ravnica. And if letting us know in a comment down below is not your style, be sure to hit us up on Twitter at MTGTheCardPool or email us at mtgthecardpool@gmail.com. I'm Stu Galetta.
And I'm Kyle Robertson, and we'll see you next time here at the Card Pool.